All right, welcome back. We are INFR2350. That's Intermediate Computer Graphics in the winter 2021 semester at Ontario Tech University. And it's week 8, part 1 of our broadcast. We're going to do an intro to deferred rendering today. Let's talk about deferred rendering in a bit. Let's get into the schedule first. So we're sitting at week 8. We moved our assignment 4 release date till this week because assignment 3 got moved to this Sunday. So what's happening is, again, a couple of things that are due this week. We're talking about deferred rendering. Assignment 3 has been moved again to this Sunday, March the 14th at midnight. That was your extension to make sure that you guys had enough information. One thing that's happening is our TA, who is amazing, has been working really, really hard to put together a video that's fully working. I know that he's been working through the video. He showed it to me yesterday, some of the stuff that he's been putting together. There's a bit of a glitch that he's working through right now. And as soon as that is corrected, and it should happen this afternoon, you should see a video and a step-by-step on how to do deferred rendering to help you with your assignment 3, which is due Sunday. Okay, so that's coming out very shortly. And again, I highly recommend you spend time with him and connect with him on Friday so that it becomes easier for you to do that. So that is, yeah, we're working on that, Adam. You should have your midterm marks out very soon. So that is the assignment 3. Assignment 4, I've posted today with all the details, and I'm going to go through all the details for assignment 4 briefly, if I can, and then we'll get into the details of the, actually what I think I might do is I'll post assignment 4 details separately offline. So I think I'll do that today, as opposed to take up the time in the lecture, because we don't have very much time, and it's a big topic that we got to kind of talk about. I'll see if we have time at the end. Also, ICE 4 is something that I've posted. It's another little microblog that I'm going to get you guys to do for Saturday. It's individual, and it shouldn't take long to do. Again, I'm looking at, 1 or 2 pages with some additional screenshots when it comes to deferred rendering. So from a deferred rendering perspective, I want you guys to think of it from that point of view today. Again, you can knock this off as soon as possible. You don't have to wait to get it done for Saturday. All right. And again, these are these little in-class exercises that I'm getting you to do, especially in-class exercise 3 and 4 so far, are going to help you with your final exam, because again, you'll have most likely a little microblog, maybe plus some additional questions to answer on your final exam during the written piece. Again, if you remember what's happening, after week 12, there's going to be in the exam period, and we'll talk about the exam in more details as we get closer. But during the exam period, you're going to have 2 types of exams. One of them is going to be a practical exam. That's going to happen second. It'll be a take-home like normal. Okay, I'm not going to restrict you to a time frame. I'm going to give you the week again to make sure it's done. And then you'll also have the other portion, which is your written. And that written portion is going to be a microblog and some other stuff. So I'm getting you to practice to get into the flow of how you're writing stuff and get feedback from the TA and from myself, so that way you can get information about how you're doing. Are you looking at things the right way? Are you analyzing things correctly? And all that kind of stuff. Is the written portion in class? No, it's going to be take home. Everything is take home. So I'm going to give you a chance, Andrew, to take it home. You have the weeks to do it. If we have a 2-week exam period, the way I'm probably going to do it right now is the first week, I'm going to give you your written portion. And then the second week, because it's take home, I'll have you do I'll release the practical portion, right? So you'll have, again, I know I'm taking up both of your weeks, of your exam period, but this way it'll spread it out for you, so it won't be as bad. And it'll spread out, I believe, the pain a little bit. So it'll be a little easier for you to handle, which is the point. Again, my role always is, in my mind, is always trying to make it as easy and straightforward for you guys as possible. Okay, so that is kind of where we are. Next week, just a reminder that we're doing checkpoint 3, and checkpoint 3 is like checkpoint 2 and checkpoint 1. Let's talk about checkpoints for a second. I was speaking to Gavin last week we had a faculty meeting, and I was speaking to him about your projects. I gave him feedback as well on the stuff that I had seen for the CG requirements, and he and I speak fairly regularly in terms of how things are going for you and all that stuff as well. If I've given you feedback when I see you, or if you've been given feedback by the TA that there's something missing or something that you have to do for your CG requirements, please make sure that you take care of it. For those people who are non-GDW students, so if you're not in GDW, by next week, there should be some kind of gamified components for your checkpoints. So I'm looking for a game. I'm not looking for a game as complex as, for example, your GDW game, but you can use, like I said before, your other components. And I'm talking about assignments 1, 2, and 3 to build up some kind of gamified level that you're going to basically show off to me on checkpoint 3, because that is going to be your GDW game. The requirements for your semester project that you're going to hand in at the end. What I'm asking you to do is build up your semester project so that by the end of semester you have something that's comparable that we can mark with the rest of the class. Okay, so that is something that I want you to see. If I don't see one of the checkpoint requirements for the non-GW teams this week is, if I don't see progress, you're going to get a knock when it comes to your mark. So please, I want to see progress on your GW games or your non-GW stuff. Also for the groups that weren't able to show progress on a number of items. So for example, if it was something that was like not started, there's some people that had not started. I'm looking for most of those items now to be started for most of the things. You've already got some shadow mapping, kind of in there. You've already, this week, we're talking about deferred rendering. So most of the things after this week, you'll have at least started, is something that I'm expecting for next checkpoint. So if you haven't, this is a time for you guys to get together with your team members over the next week or so. And because it's aligning with Gavin's review for GDW, then it's a good idea to get together and make this week coming up an important one to put together your GDW stuff. Okay, so hopefully that aligns with your expectations. Any questions around that? So checkpoint 3 next week, same requirements. Post the actual the stuff up there. Oh, one thing to note is if you don't show up for your checkpoint, you're going to lose marks for it. If you hand something in, if you don't hand something in, and if you don't show up, you get 0. I got to talk about that as well. And so please be prepared. The order will be, I'll try and make it so that it is, we'll probably go in reverse order this time around. So if I started off at the top of the list and I went down from one group to the other, group 1, 2, 3, and so on, we'll go the other way next time. So we'll give a chance for the groups that showcase their work last time. We'll get them to start, all right? So that way it'll be fair for the other people, that started first. Okay, so that's what it is for next week. Let's move on. If you have any other questions around checkpoint 3, please let me know before we stop for the day. All right, let's talk about deferred rendering. And this is the big topic of the week, right? What is deferred rendering? It's a really popular technique. And let me just preface this by saying 2 things. One, it is not a magic bullet. Okay, it's not something that is going to be like, the be all and end all of how you should do all your CG stuff. No, it's just one technique. Forward rendering is perfectly fine when you have a small number of lights, okay, as an example. And instead of having, the render targets that you have, off-screen render target for post-processing effects, what deferred rendering does is it actually separates your geometry into multiple render targets. That's what it's about. So there's really 2 main passes. The first pass is the geometry pass, and the second pass is your lighting pass. That's really how it works, okay? So we already have an idea of how passes work when we do one pass and another pass. When we started doing post-processing, your last assignment 3, which is, kind of involved with post-processing and the G buffer, deferred rendering, is something that is going to, we're building on here. All right. So So one thing it does, it reduces the amount of light calculations for the scene. So instead of having multiple lights and you're doing one calculation per light or re-rendering the scene multiple times, you're doing it less times, okay? And really what happens is the idea of deferred is that the actual light happens, the lighting calculations happen in the second pass. That's where it comes from. So what happens is, so why do we use deferred rendering? Again, we put together something called the G buffer, all right? And the G buffer is made up of different parts of your scene. So for example, we break up your scene, your 3D models and the stuff we're viewing through the camera, right? We're breaking it up, and this is how I like to see it, into by using multiple render targets. So we're breaking up, for example, the normals, the normal calculations, and we're rendering just the normals into a normal buffer, right? We're breaking up the texture coordinates, the positions and everything else. We're breaking that up into different kinds of texture coordinates, color into a different buffer as well. And this essentially is your G buffer. Your G buffer is basically all of your geometry broken out into multiple render targets. And what this allows us to do is we can compose the scene afterwards. We can break them out, do all the calculations where everything is going to be, only render the things that need to be rendered that's inside the camera's frustum, right? Outside of the camera's frustum, we're going to cull any object like normal. And then what's going to happen is we're going to produce the lighting calculations afterwards in a post-processing step. Noah's asking, would this be useful for outlines in a toon shader because I'm having some issues with my outline? Yes. Yeah, deferred rendering is definitely something you can do. And again, it would be something that where you apply the shading at the final step. So shading and all that kind of stuff, any kind of lighting calculations and shading, you're going to do it after all your geometry has been set up in the buffer. So definitely it'll help. So how's it done? We talked about these two passes. The first pass, again, consists of this vertex shader and fragment shader. And these two shaders basically gather all the required attributes to perform shading. However, we don't do any calculations initially. We don't. We wait. And what ends up happening is we have to remember the graphics pipeline. So as we move from the vertex shader to the geometry shader, across the rasterizer into the fragment shader and out the other end to the screen, that is what we want to do. But what's happening is normally when it comes to rendering, we want to take all of our geometry as an example, and we have a single render target. Okay. But what we want to do instead is, instead of taking all of our geometry and putting it into a single render target like this with forward rendering, what we want is to use multiple render targets, or MRT, if you will, right? And multiple render targets. Notice that the lighting has been crossed out here because we're not going to do lighting calculations here. Instead, we're going to take all this information, split it up in terms of our depth buffer, our normals buffer, our colors buffer, specular buffer, and so on. And then we're going to do our light accumulation up here at the end. We're going to do our accumulation buffer here. And this light accumulation buffer itself is going to basically kind of look at all the lights in the scene and how they're going to affect the pixels based on a light volume. We're going to apply these changes to the G buffer, and then we're going to have our final render target, which is going to be our full screen quad. That's how it works. Okay, again, very high level at this point. So again, we want to separate our geometry from our lighting calculations. 2 passes, like we said before. Great stuff when it comes to multiple lights, but we have to say this, there's a disadvantage. Remember, I just talked about it. There's no magic bullet. It doesn't handle transparency well. Okay, so it's a problem, right? Because think about, how are we going to do transparency when I have all my geometry split across different kinds of render targets? I got my depth, I got this, I got that, and it's all split up. How do I do transparency? Transparency is done based on I'm going to basically change the light, right, or the lightness of a pixel, so I can view something else behind that pixel, right? So 2 volumes, you have 2 geometries. I'm going to look at the other geometry behind it, and I'm going to see it based on how, I don't know, the alpha transparency value, let's say, that I pass in. but I got to do that after I do all the lighting, and it becomes a real challenge. So what we're seeing here is the pipeline that I'm showing you is the basic pipeline for deferred rendering, no transparency, and we're gonna have to look at another optimization step to do to deal with transparency issues. Okay. One thing to note is that one of the underlying ideas of deferred rendering is if the pixel isn't on the screen, it's not going to be actually shown on the physical screen, it's going to be culled. We're not going to shade something or render something that is not physically being shown this particular frame. Okay, so that's something that we're going to do. So that's another optimization that deferred lighting and deferred rendering allows us to do. So again, great slide from NVIDIA. So gbuffer, what is it? It's all the necessary per pixel lighting terms split up as an example. And so you have your normal, your position, your diffuse, your specular, albedo, and other attributes. And what it does is it limits everything into smaller parameters. Andrew says, would it be better to bake lights, or when would you want to use this over baking them or something? So to me, thanks, Alvin. I'm looking at YouTube too. I'll respond to you in a second. No, don't resend it, Alvin. Connect with me on. Sorry, I'm answering a person on YouTube as well. Alvin, if I can get you to connect with me on Discord, that would be the best way. I can respond much faster on Discord. So going back to this, then one of the questions I have is it better to bake lights or not? And the answer is the reason why we bake lights at all is if something is static in the scene. So if I have a static object, and we kind of talked about this last week when it came to shadows, right? Shadow mapping in some ways. If I have a static object, I want to bake that object in the scene so that there's it's difference between real-time lighting and baked lighting. Real-time lighting is good if it's something that's moving. But if I have a static object in the scene that the player is never going to get to, but it's in the scene itself, for example, shadows in the building that's kind of like in the background somewhere, where the player can't possibly get to that place, or it's something else in the scene that's not going to ever update, bake it. And baking is really great because what it does is it renders it and it doesn't update it. All we're doing is accumulating it, and we're not actually affecting it with real-time lighting. The lighting is going to be static. And really, if you think about what the lighting is, we're just changing the color values of the pixels so they're either brighter or darker. That's all we're doing. And we're just keeping those values the way they are in the areas that are static. Okay, so that's baked lights. And so the follow-up question is, so would you most likely use a combination of both? And the answer is, yeah, you would. Mixed lighting is a lot of times what we do in most games, most commercial games anyway. All right, so let's talk about deferred lighting. Continue. So we have this geometry split up, color, depth, and normal buffers, like we talked about before. And this is kind of what you might see. Here's just color, right? No shadows. Here's just depth. Here's just normals. And we split this up to create our G buffer. Okay, this is what we're doing. And once we have these different components, if you will, of the G buffer, we're able to do some lighting calculations a little bit easier, right? So we store these different values, and then what we do is we compose the values as an example in the final result. All right, so let's just bring this up. Here's Shader Toy. I like to look at Shader Toy. One thing I couldn't do with Shader Toy is give you guys an exercise with Shader Toy. I think Shader Toy is neat, but you can see, hopefully you guys can see this and it's not terrible, but you can see what's happening in the scene here, right? Where what I can do is you can, in this particular example, you can move the split of what you're looking at from normals, as an example, and tells you what you're looking at here. Outputting normals with specular in a single buffer. Upper left is normals, upper right is specular. As an example, bottom left is diffuse and normals. So we add diffuse and normals together. We have on the bottom right is the diffuse calculated from the RGB or XYZ normals. Okay, so that's what they are. All right, so this is kind of an example of how we're splitting up the calculations into different render targets. And all we're doing here with this split that we have here is we're just showing different parts of the buffer, the G buffer. So kind of neat. All right, so that is an example of it with shader toy. So kind of cool. I like it. So what's the classic approach? Really, it involves rendering each object and applying lighting passes to it. So imagine if I had multiple lights in the scene. Let's suppose I had like 6 lights, 10 lights, or whatever. If I could do it, if my GPU is fast enough and my CPU is fast enough combined, then I could render the entire scene 6 times, 1 for each light, because that's what I would have to do. I would take the first set of lights, the first light, whatever that is, I would just choose a light, apply the lighting calculations for that light, and then render the pixels, let's say off screen, do it again, do it again, do it again a bunch of times until I have all the pixels from all the lights over and over again affecting different parts of the scene. Could I still do this way to create an accumulation of light in a particular place? We could. The problem with this approach is, and this forward rendering approach is, sometimes what you get is brightness values or illumination values that are a little bit unrealistic when you add one light on top of the other light. Depending on how you do it, you can adjust for this by using by normalizing the light values from 0 to 1, or but at the end of the day, you're rendering the scene 6 times per frame for 6 lights. That doesn't make any sense. It doesn't produce a great in terms of performance. It's not great for performance. One thing to note, when we look at a 6 lights is probably doable. 4 lights is doable. Once you get to 20 lights, I'm rendering the entire scene, as complex as it is, 20 times per frame. That is a lot. And your CPU, you're going to see the frame hit that you're going to get, or frame rate hit that you're going to get with your project. So that's why we use deferred rendering. We use deferred rendering as a response to multiple lights in the scene. So the difference would be that, for worst case scenario, worst batch count, we would have number of objects multiplied by number of lights, right? If all objects were be affected by lights, right? But a lot of times we have a fixed cost, which is the number of objects plus the number of lights. And that's more like what the, kind of the performance ratio is, typically. Worst case, we still have this kind of thing here if I want to light up a bunch of objects, but really that's how it works. So again, what we want to try and figure out, we use the G buffer to calculate the color contribution of each light in the scene per pixel. All right, that's what we're doing, right? And one thing that we're going to be talking about is, when we talk about lighting related information, is we're going to be talking about light volumes. Okay, we'll get to that. So again, the G buffer, it allows us to do full lighting results for every pixel, solving the BRDF problem, which is the bidirectional reflectance distribution function. But we only do that once, right? As opposed to forward rendering, when we do that multiple times. We're calculating the light in the scene multiple times. We only do that once with the G buffer, by using the G buffer. Okay. So again, really cool advantages. We decouple the scene geometry from the lighting, which is a good thing, right? We can render many lights. Simple management of complex lighting resources. That's really an important one. And also this one, I think, is the big one, which is simplification of the software rendering pipeline, because we break it down in terms of the way things are drawn, right? How much some disadvantage we just talked about? Transparency is a big one. That's the big problem with deferred rendering, okay, or deferred shading. Transparency. Why? I mean, again, we're looking at the Z buffer or the Z buffer, which is really the depth buffer, right? And we can handle this by doing a couple of, there's a couple of, I'll say, techniques we can try and use for transparency. One of them is delaying and sorting the rendering of transparent portions of the scene until later. So we can do that too. So, but again, that's another post-processing step. So think about now, one thing that we have to do with transparency is treat it like a post-processing step. Whereas before, for forward rendering, we didn't have to do that. Okay, so that's an extra step and more work for us to do. Also, I have to also mention something that's not mentioned here, which is there's a lot of overhead when it comes to writing this stuff, right? One of the challenges one of the challenges that we're going to have is, when you're restructuring your code, if you have your own, for example, game engine, and you want to somehow now start doing deferred rendering, well, now you got to do all kinds of work to make sure that deferred rendering is supported on your engine, right? And a lot of rework, a lot of rewriting, right? So it's not something that it's a simple plug in and go kind of scenario, right? Also, the other thing that happens is there's a lot of memory usage when it comes to the G buffer. Multiple materials are going to increase the memory bandwidth of your G buffer. So for example, if you have a lot of materials, different kind of textures in the scene, can you imagine all those things have to be split up as well and combined into different multiple render targets? Okay. One question I had is, are for loops not good? No, you're going to see that for loops are a bad thing. Any kind of branching or for loops on the GPU are bad because of the parallel nature of the hardware, which we're going to talk about later. Says, yeah, I'm already struggling to make that work with shadow mapping. It's hard. It's really, really hard to do. And why? Because you have to think about the overhead. Exactly. That's what it is, right? How to make it work and be performant. That's the challenge, right? So deferred rendering, great. Multiple lights, bad in other ways. And we're going to talk about how to make use of it. Again, let's think about this breakdown: diffuse color and the Z buffer, surface normals, and your final compositing into one. Okay. And notice that we have the shadows in the final composition as well, where you have the shadows depending on where the lights. And of course you would, because all your light calculations to create your shadows and your shadow maps happen at the final compositing step, right? Again, think about this as a post-processing step. So you have all your geometry, then you have your lighting calculations, then you have your shadows, then you have your post-processing effects. You want to add bloom, you want to add depth of field, you want to add, I don't know, grain, screen grain, or anything like that. You have to add all that later on. Okay, so that's another step, another post-process. And again, this has to happen every frame. Okay, so again, let's think about it in terms of steps. Render the scene to attribute buffers. And so think about these as multiple render targets: normal, albedo, specular color, and depth. And then for each light, do a shadow pass. Stencil operations, shadow buffering, all that kind of stuff is what you want to do for each of your lights, right? And then what you're going to do is render the light's bounding volume. We're going to talk about this. What is the bounding volume? So think about how we're going to do it. I'll talk about this in a second. As well as accumulate. There's your accumulation buffer. Accumulate all the light, the diffuse specular light contributions in the scene, right? And when we say accumulation, that's going to change your lightness values, or your values, let's just say values for each pixel, per pixel, right? And then after that, perform all your post-processing effects in terms of particles, blooming, streaks, fog, tone mapping, all that kind of stuff is going to happen at the end. Okay, that's how it works. So again, it's a number of passes, and you're rendering again off screen, and finally to a full screen quad. Okay, that's what you're going to kind of do. All right, so here could be some examples of, again, another G buffer. I'm showing you this over and over again. There's some great examples here that are in the PowerPoint to give you a sense of what your scene should look like, right? If I was just going to draw position information, or normals, or the albedo, or the specular as an example, I should be able to split this up into different buffers, right? And this is how some of these will look. All right, so again, so we're going to take the textures from the G buffer, and we're going to use them in a second pass called the lighting pass, where we render everything to a full screen quad. All right, that's the idea of what we're going to do. And again, what we're going to think about is this idea of, here's our scene from before. We have all our geometry. We're going to split this geometry up into multiple render targets, so MRT, and that's going to form up our G buffer. Okay, and finally, and it's hard to see this at the end because this is so dark down here on this side, you're going to see the lighting, the final lighting calculations that are going to be used. Okay. What are multiple render targets? It allows the render pipeline, to split up each of pieces of geometry into render textures. That's what they're going to be. So I've got different render textures. That's what I'm doing really. I'm creating a texture off screen, and then I'm combining them later. Okay. And let's think about how bad it would be without multiple render targets. Well, what I'm doing with multiple render targets is I'm taking, light or emissive, normal, diffuse, specular. I'm taking all these multiple render targets as an example, and I'm combining them. How would I do this otherwise? Well, now I'm back to deferred rendering again, right? Because once I start thinking about, doing calculations, when it comes to all the things in my scene separately, it's much easier than doing the lighting calculations as an example and moving things in the scene afterwards. So what I want to do is, again, figure out what's in my scene and what's out of my scene, right? That's what I'm doing with my geometry. Once I have my geometry, I'm going to get a bounding volume, which is going to represent my light, and that's the only thing that's going to be seen. Everything else I really don't care about. Here's an example. Here's my target image. I may want something to look like this, right? Again, this is my target image. And let's suppose, things that I want to think about. Depth buffer, my view space normal, my specular intensity, my specular roughness, screen space 2D motion vector, albedo, deferred composition, and finally some post-processing effects. Okay, these are all the things I want. So here's my depth. So the first thing I get is depth information, right? My depth information is here, right? And then I split it up into my view space normal. So here's my view space normal. So that would look like. Okay, specular roughness. You can see where that's going to be in there. That again gives us the idea of, kind of the roughness of an object, the shine or the dullness in some ways as well. And then we have our normal calculations. So our 2D motion vector, right? And finally, our texture color. So this is color, but you can see that this is pretty flat, right, as an example. And then we add in our composition. Here's our deferred composition, right, where we combine everything together. And finally, we have our post-processing effects, including depth of field, bloom, motion blur, everything, and kind of combine into one. So that's how we combine everything at the end. The one that really strikes me is this one. So this is kind of albedo. It's unlit, if you think about what this is. There is no lighting that's in kind of in play. Look at the difference between slide 34 and slide 35. Look at that one. So there's the unlit, and then there's lit. And the lit scene, what it does, it darkens areas that have no light, and it lightens areas that are going to be affected by the light, okay? And then after we have our lighting composition, so this is the accumulation of all the light kind of applied to the scene, then is when we add in our bloom and post-processing effects. So things like motion blur and that kind of stuff that you're seeing here. Okay. All right, so some rules about multiple render targets. We can have up to 4 active render targets at the same time. All of them must have the same number of bits, right? I can mix render targets with different number of channels. And here's some examples of what's okay and what's not okay. And here's the layout example. All right. So again, I have 3 16-bit multiple render targets where, for example, I have diffuse, red, green, and blue. Again, with specular. I have a position, X, Y, and Z, emissive, right? And I also have my X, Y, and Z normals, and that extra one is free. So these are all the render targets, and each render target has 4 possible channels. Okay. So here's an example of that. All right, so, and this is what Adam was talking about. It's cool, but how about shadows? Shadows is a problem, right? So I need to render the light as a geometry volume, and then I can get the shadow calculations happening, because that's going to be different. Remember, in a forward rendered scene, I'm getting the position of, we're solving that other equation we talked about earlier, and we're calculating the light and how it's, the reflectance and the illumination and so on. We're making that lighting calculation. and it's easier for us to calculate where the shadows are going to land, right? But when it comes to deferred rendering, oh man, how is that going to happen? How do I do 100 lights, with shadow? That's impossible now, right? Well, we need to use a shadow map, and this is where shadow mapping comes into play. And we talked about shadow maps a little bit before, and it comes into play a lot here with our deferred rendering. All right, so one thing that we want to do is we want to start computing lighting by thinking about it as a volume. Okay, this is interesting. So I want to think of spotlights as a cone. I want to think about a point light as a sphere. And I want to think about some kind of directional light as a quad or a box. Remember, when I'm thinking about the directional lights, I'm thinking about them as some kind of, it's not a perspective object. Usually, it's usually done in ortho projection, as opposed to a perspective projection, right? So that's for me what a directional light is. A directional light is a light from an infinite amount of distance away, the sun, as an example, coming in from a certain angle, right? That's what really a directional light is. So we can use a quad or a box to do that. And then we'll read the G buffer, compute the radiance based on where the light volume is, and blend that into the frame buffer, the final optimization, the final step, right? There's a ton of optimizations we can do to make this work better. And we can do things like clipping, occlusion, all kinds of culling that we want to do that can help us with anything that's outside of the light volume. So think about that. We make an object, and I want to overlap. I want to only calculate, and I'm not talking about volumetric lighting. This is not volumetric lighting. This is just me using a piece of geometry, a cone or a sphere or a quad, to really try and see where in my scene will that lighting apply. What pixels in the scene will, the light volume affect, kind of thing. That's what I'm doing. And that's also, I'm going to calculate my shadows. So I want to render the lights, right? And I want to think about it in terms of a full screen quad, right? For ambient or directional light. I'm going to use some kind of sphere for a point light. Like I said, a cone or a pyramid a lot of times are also good. For a spotlight, you can also use a frustum, if that makes sense as well. And other custom shapes that you want to use when it comes to your lighting, depending on what kind of lighting effects that you want. Right? And what we really want to think about is anything outside of the view of the camera, right? We want to ignore, right? That's a real great thing about deferred rendering. That is an optimization step, okay? Because otherwise what's happening is we're going to try and apply light calculations on something that's never going to be shown. So here's an example of the lighting pass with the data in the G buffer, right? The final lighted colors can be calculated by iterating over each of the G buffer's textures, pixel by pixel, and using their contents as input to the lighting algorithms, right? So I'm getting position, I'm getting normals, I'm getting specular as an example, and then I'm gonna input those, from my lighting pass, right? And so here's an example of applying lighting calculations to a scene. Now you can see that some areas out here are black or not being lit at all, and only the area that I care about is lit. It's the exact same scene as we saw earlier, right, with the several slides ago, I would say, which would be somewhere back here on page 43. I'll just jump back here. So it's this scene here, right? We're seeing all the objects, right, in the scene, but all we care about rendering is the stuff that the light volumes intersect with. That's all we care about. Okay. So again, think about this, that we only want to shade the surfaces inside the light volume. Anything else is wasted work. Okay. And I think this is great. Inside the light volumes, this is where the light volume is. This is outside the light volume. It's not going to be shaded. outside the light volume, but will be shaded, and lighting is discarded. All right, so this is something that we can do. This is the view frustum. So this is anything that's inside the view. Okay, if it's outside the light volume, right, as an example, then why would I shade something? Why would I apply a shader to something outside of my light volume? That means I don't care about specular. I don't care about any other colors. We just want literally just shapes, right, outside of my my light volume. Why? And this is when I say light volume, including attenuation. So the light volume is not just all bright. It's attenuated light. We start in the middle. We'll talk about attenuation in a bit, where we start bright in the middle and then it kind of attenuates, or it becomes more diffuse, at the edges. So here at the edges, you're going to have, kind of a dithered area, right, where there is less light until right at the edge where this, like for example, this dotted line is going to be no light. So in dark rooms, can you expect more FPS since it doesn't render the stuff that light isn't affecting, or is it still rendering? You're still doing calculations on positioning because you want to bring those up, but you're going to get really good performance, right, as an example, because all your lighting up and all your shading, including not just lighting up, but shading as well, are things inside the light volumes. So yeah, because it's dark, you get a lot of black, right? Black is all pixels are off. So yes. All right. Again, only regions that fail the depth test represent objects within the light volume. Okay, so that's one thing that we know. So only these bits are shaded, as an example. And then we're going to talk about some other additional optimizations in a second. So are we good? Are we good with how the system works? At a very high level, we have our G buffer. After we have our G buffer, we do our lighting calculations based on light volumes. And again, we think about a light volume that we're going to use that's relative, to the type of light we're using. All right, so I got lots of point lights. It's going to be lots of spheres in this sphere volumes in the scene that I may have to overlap to get an accumulation buffer going, light accumulation buffer, to create the effect that I want. Okay. And that includes things like I've got my directional light, I could have point lights, a directional light, some kind of ambient lighting, a bunch of other stuff that I want to have all together, and I accumulate that up. If I have ambient lighting, by the way, even dark areas of the room where I can see them, right? If I have ambient lighting. Sometimes we also use things like other kinds of things like stencil buffers and those kind of things to give myself an outline, a crisp outline, even in the dark. Right? Sometimes it's not realistic, but more playable. All right. How about other optimizations? There's something called a fully deferred engine, right? Which basically what it does is we render the unique scene geometry pass into G-buffer render targets for material properties, and we write to the depth buffer as normal. Right, so that's the first thing that we do with our fully deferred engine. This is another version of deferred rendering, as an example. And then we do a shading pass where we can kind of put together an accumulation buffer and finally out to a depth buffer, and for our final pass. Okay, so that's what it does. So advantages there: fully deferred pros, scene geometry is decoupled from lighting, like we talked about before. Shading lighting only applies to visible fragments, which is kind of what we're doing here. A reduction in render states, this is important, and G-buffer is already produces data required for post-processing. Bad things: significant engine rework, we just talked about that, requires more memory, costly and complex MSAA, and forward rendering required for translucent or transparent objects. So think about that, forward rendering combined with deferred rendering. So there's like another rendering, a whole other rendering step that we're going to use for transparent objects. So that's another, like, double the work pretty much. Other optimizations, light pre-pass. Okay, so here's something we can first we do a first geometry pass into normal and depth buffer, as an example. So this is the first part. We take our geometry, put it into normal depth buffer, and once we've done that, then what we want to try and do is we perform all the lighting calculations into the light buffer using only the normal and depth buffer as input textures, right? And then we render the geometries enclosing the light area, all right, as an example, and then write the light color times the normals, times attenuation, and so on, and specular, and we write all that out. What's the advantage of that over, and finally we combine everything in the second geometry pass. We do another geometry pass, and we combine everything to have the, kind of the output. So you can see the output looks like this, right? So again, really great thing. Scene geometry is decoupled from lighting. Shading, lighting only apply to visible fragments. Gbuffer already produces data, all the same stuff. But here's the new one material fetch per pixel, regardless of the number of lights. This is kind of the idea of a lighting pre-pass, right? Bad thing, significant engine rework, costly, complex MSAA, forward rendering required for translucent objects, 2 scene geometry passes required instead of 1, and a unique lighting model, which is different than something that wouldn't work for every game, okay? Because the lighting model is going to change for the game or the scene that you're making. Semi-deferred, here's other methods, right? Light index deferred rendering. We store IDs of visible lights into a light buffer, and then we use a stencil or blending to mark light IDs. Okay, so these are the ones that I want to use. We do deferred shadows, right? There's another one. Most basic form of deferred rendering, deferred shadows. We perform shadowing from screen size depth buffer. And a lot of times, again, it says that a lot of graphic engines use this because it makes sense. Okay, so this is kind of semi-deferred methods of rendering. So we don't have to defer everything. We don't have to defer all of our stuff, just part of our scene, and we can still have some optimizations. So again, when we think about deferred shading or rendering, before we move on to the next piece, which is transparency, it's not a magic bullet. Okay, that's one thing I want you to take out of this. Not a magic bullet. There's more than one method out there, and there's specializations in forward rendering and in deferred rendering that include optimizations to solve different problems. And one of the biggest problems is multiple lights in the scene. The other problem that we're going to see in a second is transparency. So how do I solve transparency? So it doesn't support transparency out of the box because it only shades the nearest surfaces, right? We don't care about the surfaces that are off screen or whatever, right? So one method we can use is we can draw transparent objects last, and we can use something called depth peeling, okay? And we can blend everything into a final image and sort of a back to front, kind of a way of doing things, as always. We can use quote unquote normal shading and lighting, and we can use the depth buffer for the rest, okay? So that's kind of a way of doing it. There's other possible solutions that we're going to talk about: stippled transparency, forward rendering, multiple depth peeled deferred passes, deferred shading with front rendering, and something called inferred shading. So these are all different ways of solving the transparency problem. Okay, let's take a look at some of them. So stippled transparency, what is that? Write both pixels into the data buffer, right? You can't write two things exactly in the same pixel, but what if we wrote the information into 2 pixels that are very close together and then blurred them together later, right? That's the stippled approach, right? I want to blur 2 pixels together to create that transparency type effect because I got 2 pixels, one from some object behind the object that's transparent, as an example. Problem: many shaders in the pipeline will sample a few nearby pixels from the data buffer, assuming that those pixels are likely to be from the same object, which is going to cause more overhead. Okay, so that's a problem. Here's another one: multiple depth peeled deferred passes. Okay, again, here's how it goes. In each pass, we rerun the entire deferred renderer for a transparent object. Okay, each pass. And then at the end, we collapse the layers back down into a single layer, blending the colors appropriately for each pixel. Woohoo! If we can do that. Problem: the primary disadvantage of this technique is we repeat the entire lighting stage for each layer. So that means, like, if I have multiple layers of transparency, I got to do the lighting calculation over and over again. That's multiple depth peeled deferred passes. By the way, can you imagine a paper called that? How to do deferred rendering with multiple depth peeled deferred passes. Woohoo! Right? There's papers like that. If you look at SIGGRAPH, it's pretty crazy. The names get wild. All right, depth peeling. Here's another one. You draw every transparent object in its own layer, and then you merge all the layers back together. Depth peeling, all right? You pack items which do not overlap in the screen space into the same layer, okay? So they don't overlap, they're in the same layer. And so we can have here, we can have 2 layers, a blue, green, and pink. As an example, blue, green, and pink are the one layer. And then you have orange as the separate layer. Here's the example, right? If we render the blue, green, and pink spheres first, and then render the orange sphere second, we'll get all of the transparencies done correctly. So we're just doing it into different layers. So that's kind of the idea of depth peeling. I like this approach, but there's a problem. There are many drawbacks in terms of rendering, reflections, non-planar geometries, which is the big one, as well as backside illumination that can occur. All right, so we don't want this to happen. It won't look perfect, depth peeling, but it definitely is a simple solution. Sometimes you get an effect that's interesting anyway, right? You may want to keep this effect, but it's not an optimal way of doing things. All right, here's one. Deferred shading with forward rendering. All right, that's what front rendering is, forward rendering. So the forward renderer, front renderer, is used to process transparent objects, and it fits well inside the deferred shading pipeline. So now you're going to, you're going to do it twice. You're going to use the forward renderer, or the front renderer, as what they're calling it here, to do your basic transparencies, all the transparency calculations and all that kind of stuff, right? And when the front rendering is performed, the final picture is finally rendered. So you do the forward rendering last. That's the step that you do afterwards, okay? So again, here's the breakdown. We render all opaque geometry to the G buffer, only opaque stuff. And then we bind the G buffer as a texture, right? For each light in the scene, we draw a full screen rectangle and calculate lighting at each pixel using the data from the G buffer. We save the results to a P buffer, which is really a pixel buffer. That's what it is. We sort all the transparent entities in back to front order to give us that layering effect. And then we render all the transparent geometry using the forward renderer, and we blend the result to the P buffer using the depth buffer to filter out any non-visible transparent geometry. And then finally, we copy the P buffer, which is the pixel buffer, to the frame buffer, which is the thing that we're going to see on the screen. Looks like this. So a bunch of different passes, right? So again, we have our deferred shader geometry stage. We make our G buffer. We create our pixel shader, right? We put our pixel shaders, we pass them into the deferred shading lighting stage. We light everything. And then what we do is we take this G buffer and we pass it into the vertex, the information from the G buffer, the geometry, pass it into the vertex shader for our forward rendering, okay? Just like we normally do forward rendering, right? So we have all that information in the vertices. We're doing another pass, right? And then from there, we're going to get another frame buffer object, which we're going to call the P buffer, pixel buffer. And once we've got their pixel buffer, and it's kind of combined with the color that we're going to get from the pixel shader from the output of our deferred rendering stage, these two things combine to form out our P buffer, and our P buffer is going to be output to the frame buffer, which is the screen buffer, which is the thing that we're going to see at the end. Okay, so that is kind of combining forward rendering with deferred rendering. And as you can see, both systems have to be in place. Now, I have to mention something. This is not a bad idea because not everything requires to use deferred rendering. So imagine if I can have a mix of things working at the same time. I can have just deferred lighting when I don't have any transparencies. There might be scenes like that. If I have multiple lights, I have forward lighting, forward rendering and shading. If I only have a small number of lights in the scene, as an example. And if I have really complex scenes, I can engage both deferred and forward rendering into different passes to create a very complex scene. A good example of that would be some kind of cinematic or something like that that I want to make happen. It could be an interesting explosion or a very photorealistic scene that I want to create. We're getting more and more of this happening all the time. And so here's the results. So we have some kind of diffuse color texture used for the test model in this study. By the way, if you want to read about where this idea came from, The PDF is the link to the PDF is attached below, so you can take a look at it. So they have the diffuse color. They combine it with a normal map for the test model, and then what they do is here we have our buffer with diffuse color. Here's the buffer with normals, right? As an example, so we're accumulating everything. Here's the buffer with specular color. Here's just the depth buffer, right? So they split everything up. And then finally, what you get is the final picture produced by the deferred renderer. So this is just a deferred rendering by itself. Okay, so deferred rendering, done. We're at this stage of the, of this entire process, right? And we haven't done, if I'm not wrong, if I go back to that light, oops, I'm a little bit ahead. We've also got lighting in there too. So we've actually done the lighting. All right, then what you want to do is we use the same picture but rendered transparent with a front render or a forward render. So this is your transparent object, right? And now it's layered from back to front. Okay, so where you have other objects and the further back from a Z buffer perspective, right? They're going to be rendered in solid, and maybe this particular cube is rendering transparent. And so what you do is you have some potential artifacts, right, where you have things layered in the wrong order, all right? And finally, you have an effect of what you have. This is the final result. This is the result you want, all right, as an example with the front rendering. And this is kind of a problem that you might get. All right, combining deferred and forward rendering. So here's an example of that with our previous scene that we got from Learn OpenGL. You can see that you've got a bunch of these light volumes that are cubes, as an example, and the cubes are layered on top of the geometry that's in the scene. So it doesn't look right, okay? Instead, what we want, right, is the cubes to be layered in their proper depth values. So take a look at the depth, and we want these cubes to be layered in the right order, where we have, the meshes that should be in front of the cubes, occluding the light volumes. Okay, that's what it should be look like this. This is what it should look like. Okay. Again, and we can do that by ensuring that the light passes and that the this idea is followed. We want to follow this this pipeline, this new pipeline that we're creating to do both the deferred rendering and the forward rendering pass. All right, let's talk about light volumes a little bit. So we want to solve this idea of an attenuation equation. For a brightness, depending on how bright or how intense the light is, right, we want to have some kind of brightness value. And what we want to do is, as the light travels further from the source, right, what ends up happening is it becomes dimmer and dimmer. And what this is called, of course, is attenuation. So we have our light volume, right, as an example. And what we want to get is we want to use the attenuation function. And what this attenuation function will look like when it is, I'm sorry, I'm going to skip here because I want to make sure that we hit our time targets. So really what it is attenuation is a reduction in the intensity of light over distance. That's really what it is. And what we're trying to do in CG is kind of mimic what that looks like in the real world, all right? So in the real world, what really happens is lights are generally really bright when you're close by, but the brightness of a light source diminishes quickly at the start, and the remaining light intensity more slowly diminishes over distance, okay? So what this looks like is, there's a graph for this that I'm going to show you in a second. It looks like this. I'm skipping. It looks kind of like this. So when we're up close, the light intensity is very high. But as we move away from the light in terms of distance, then the light tends to attenuate, or it looks like it's dropping off until we don't see light anymore. All right, so that's kind of the way it works. So how do we mimic this effect? Because we got to do it in a way that makes sense to us, right? So going back to the attenuation equation, we have this equation here, and with some tweaking math, we can obtain an equation that looks like this, right? And of course, this looks very similar to what we've used in the past. If we use the quadratic equation, ax squared plus bx plus c, right, we can see that we get an equation that looks like this, which is the general equation to calculate the light volume's radius. That's really what it is, right? And once we have this general equation, then we can start calculating the attenuation of the light. Again, there's some really simple ways of doing that, and Nicholas is going to go over that with you, coming up in his next tutorial or so. One thing that we talked about earlier that you guys asked about is for the GPU and GLSL is that it's really, really bad at calculating loops or branches. And the reason for this is because it's highly parallel. And most architectures have a requirement that for large collection of threads, they need to run the exact same shader code for it to be efficient. So what that means is if I have a loop, I'm looping not just that one thing, I'm looping it parallel across different processes multiple times. And that's why looping is a terrible idea, and so is branching. Because branching, what that does is it creates both the true and false versions of the branch, right? It calculates both of those things every frame, right? So that's a really bad thing to do. So please try and avoid looping and branching. And the way we can avoid branching, a lot of times what we use is a texture for that, right? We can make use of a gradient texture that goes from, let's say, from 0 to 1 or 0 to 255 as an example, where we have different levels of gradients, right? Or from 0 to 1, and we can sample from that texture, to get a result. So using a texture is just information, right? And it's a lot easier for us to do sampling to get a variation in how something looks than for us to use an if statement. If it's less than this, then do that. Don't do that. Just, sample from a certain portion of the texture. All right, so that is something that we want to use. I want to say this, though, and I think this is a great thing that was added to this PowerPoint, which is don't panic, guys, right? I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges when it comes to deferred rendering, and I found this one of the most difficult topics that we have in intermediate graphics in general, is people panic. They don't know how to put the light volumes in place. They don't know how to do the G buffer. There's a lot of technology being used here at the same time, a lot of reworking of your engine, and people panic. And I want you to think about this as take it one step at a time, right? So render spheres, start with rendering spheres. Start with simple light volumes. Do one light at a time. See how that works. And then build on it from there, all right? Here's don't panic, continue. So again, use the same deferred fragment shader for rendering the sphere. And think about what this does. So this is our other image that we had from OpenGL, Learn OpenGL. So here's the light volumes. They're just spheres, and the only part that's going to be showing, right, inside of the scene is only the area that is being affected or overlapping with the sphere. Okay, so that's what's being shown. The rest is black. It's not going to be shaded. It's not going to be rendered. We don't care about this part. We only care about this part right now, okay? And that's where you would start. If you can get that, that is a great step in how everything is going to look, okay? One thing we also have to consider, other things to consider are post-processing effects. We talked about this, and we do this as a final step when we do another post-processing step at the end, okay? And usually we have one or more passes depending on the type of post-processing effects we want to add into our scene. So again, anti-aliasing is also something of an issue, right? So what we call super sampling, one frame buffer is painful, but super sampling 5 multiple render targets, that's like 5 times painful, right? Because it's really bad. So super sampling, a lot of times hardware supported MSAA, right? Screen aliasing or whatever is incompatible with deferred shading. So when you look at some games, even on commercial game engines, if you turn on MSAA as well as deferred rendering, it'll be like, no, can't do that because it's just really painful to do, and it doesn't make any sense. So think about how that is going to affect your anti-aliasing as well. So sometimes what you might get is harder shadows, right? When it comes to the deferred rendering step, depending on if you're using a combined deferred rendering and forward rendering kind of pipeline. So when is deferred rendering awesome? Because we talked about a bunch of things, good things, bad things. Here's one main thing. You got lots of lights in the scenes. You know, as an example, outdoor daytime scenes, probably not a good case, right? Why? Because it's brightly lit. How are you going to know that there's multiple lights in the scene anyway if it's already lit? All right. So indoor scenes, that's where you want to do more of the deferred rendering. Why? Because you have lights that are going to take effect of the scene. Lights have an effect. Outside where it's brightly lit, lights have less of an effect. If it's also ideal when there's non-overlapping lights, a lot of lights that are in the scene, but they're not moving around each other. Nighttime scenes with a lot of dynamic lights, some kind of magic effect, a post-processing effect where you're doing a magic portal or something like that. That is a great idea. You know, using some kind of lights that are on particle system with lots of lights, explosions, and those kind of things. That's where you can use deferred rendering, and it works great. Why? You don't care about transparency necessarily, right? So those things are where you'd want to use deferred rendering, and it's going to give you more bang for your buck in terms of performance than forward rendering when you have multiple lights. Okay, so that is deferred rendering in a nutshell. Okay, last thing for today. In-class exercise number 4. I posted this one up on Canvas for you. You're going to create another microblog, like I said, and this same detail is posted up on Canvas, but I wanted to go over it with you. What you're going to do is you're going to get a first scan. I want you to kind of look at this, and I say scan and not read for a reason, all right? Because some people are, when they look at something like this, here's what the article looks like. I don't expect you, it's like TLDR, right? I don't expect you to read every piece of this. But one thing I want you to focus on are the pieces that we've incorporated into the presentation. So we've kind of taken these two pieces and have incorporated into the presentation. And we talk about things like GPU culling, and there's some great examples of this. Let's see if I can do this without volume. So you can see where examples of GPU culling are being shown here. This is an example of what's being done. And we're doing this with deferred shading, right? We're going to use deep, this. And it also talks about deferred rendering and GPU performance in Wolfenstein 2, which is kind of a great thing to look at, a little study. So take a look at this thing as well, right? Where you can kind of see how deferred shading and rendering and GPU culling is being used in the scene. So take a look at this, scan through this article a little bit to get yourself an idea of how it can be used, right? And then what I want you guys to do is, after you scan this article to get an idea of how it's used in a recent game, I want you to select a game. Again, you can choose any game you like to demonstrate this. So let's take a look at some stuff from Wikipedia. Wikipedia actually lists a bunch of games. Dark room scanning. Sorry. So Jonathan says it's still calling the shadows, going through each fragment. The result is still 0. You can make it efficient by turning off lights. Yeah. So this is the idea that you want to talk. You want to discuss that kind of stuff in your blog. So here's an example of some deferred lighting in commercial games. And you can see that there's some commercial games that have been listed with deferred lighting and shading, as well as game engines featuring deferred shading or rendering techniques. For example, Unity also uses it. You can turn it on and off. Unreal, of course, does it. But I want you guys to look at these games up here, and get ideas of a game that uses deferred lighting and shading, and pick one, not of these, but any game that you want to talk about. Maybe a game that you're really used to looking at with a lot of lights in the scene, maybe an indoor scene. Remember, this is where the deferred rendering is going to come into play, and discuss it. Talk about what the developers did. Did they do a good job? As an example, do we see any issues? Are there transparency problems? Are there shadow issues with anti-aliasing problems with multiple lights? What other techniques could they have used? You can research some stuff. Think about some things that the developers could have used instead, right? Maybe forward rendering or a combination of. right? Is GPU culling being used? Do you see that there's a call for potentially GPU culling if there's a lot of objects in the scene that you don't want to draw all at once to improve performance? What do you think, right? Include some screenshots of the game, and it'll be the same submission criteria as last time. So that is going to be due Saturday. It's individual, and your assignment 3 is due Sunday. Okay, that's the time frame from that. Your assignment 3 has already been extended, right? So now this one you can do it anytime you want. I recommend knock this off, guys, as fast as possible. Get your thoughts done now that the fires are hot. Now that we've talked about deferred rendering and all that stuff, you might have an idea of what you want to talk about. Get it done now. Don't wait till it's done later. All right, that is this part. And you know what? We have 10 more minutes, and I'm going to spend the 10 minutes talking about assignment 4. All right, so we have time. I can kind of combine this into one. I've kind of raced through the deferred rendering piece, and hopefully that gave you a good idea of how it works. Let's talk about assignment 4. Assignment 4 has already been posted. It's due Sunday, April the 11th. Woo-hoo! That's way far off, you might think, but it's not that far off. And it's also the same time that your GDW requirements are also due around this time. Again, we may vary that due date as well, depending on how much time we have at the end of semester, okay? But your GDW requirements are slated to be due around the same time. But this is to be done in groups of 2 or 3. And this is deferred lighting. So we've done deferred rendering and post-processing. This assignment, I'm going to allow you to use assignment 3 as a base. And I'm giving you 10 free marks for it. If you use assignment 3 as a base, or you create a brand new scene if you want, you're only going to get 10 marks for it. All right. I recommend use assignment 3. All right. And what you're going to do is you're going to build on top of assignment 3, right? You're going to build assignment 4. And what I'm asking you to do is something looks like this: dynamic light preparation. This step, which is implement a dynamic light that moves in the scene and has a toggle to be controllable. Okay, so that's your dynamic light. Let's think about rendering and lighting. Render your light volumes and compute lighting into an accumulation frame buffer. Okay, so that's what's going to happen there. All right. So an accumulation frame buffer, right? And it gives you some hints on what to do. And then you're going to composite the light buffer with the original scene color for the final lighting results. So that's just showing you steps on how it's going to look at the end. Okay. Multiple dynamic lights. So you have one light, you figure that out. Now you're going to have multiple dynamic lights in the scene, and how are they going to look? All right. So here's, again, one, 64 point lights, and this 64 point lights with light volumes turned on. Okay. And then here are your debug with toggle keys. So again, one is show your scene composited with one deferred light source. That's one. Toggle on and off viewing the deferred light volumes. I should be able to see those volumes, those spheres, or the cubes, or whatever you're using to make the light volumes happen. Right? And then I also want you to draw the position depth buffer only, draw the normal buffer. So this is where it builds on the last assignment, assignment 3, and it builds up into assignment 4. The rest is pretty much the same as before. Your demo video is, oh, this should actually say part 5, not part 4. Their demo video is the same, and basically what ends up happening is all of those break down into 100 marks. So 10 marks for your base, 20 for dynamic lighting preparation, 30 for rendering and lighting, 20 for multiple dynamic lights, and 10 for debug features, 10 for your video. And that is how your assignment 4 is going to be due. Again, this thing is due April 11th, and it's to be done in groups of 2 or 3. What I've given you the option of doing for group assignments is switching groups. So this one uses group assignment 4 or assignment group 4. So if you have to re-register for groups for this one as well. I've mentioned this before in the past, but just in case you forgot, staying in assignment group 3, you won't be able to see or do assignment 4 unless you re-register for the next group. And what this does is it forces you to register for a new group, as opposed to me assuming that you're going to stay in the same group that you were before. Okay, so that's what it does. Please make sure you re-register for or sign up for the next group. So that is really everything we covered in a nutshell. Any questions? Guys, thank you so much then. We're going to finish for today. Next week, remember, is checkpoint 3. I want you to come prepared to present, and I'm looking forward to your optimizations and your updates for your GDW project. Guys, thank you so much. I'll stick around for any questions that you might have in class. Otherwise, I'll stop doing the video now. Thank you.